Let's get started. I sometimes take a quick look at past notes to get my mind going on thoughts. And then I'll look at a phrase and I think, what does that mean? I figure if I can figure this out, it must be something really important. Here's one. It says, man bites dog. Something around there. Man bites dog. It's right there in the middle of my notes. Man bites dog. Must be something about media or
It's a film, no?
I'm sorry?
It's a film, no?
Is it a film?
Yeah. And there was just an exhibit in Philadelphia named after the film. An art exhibit called Meditation.
Oh, there's something here. There's something here. I have to follow it up.
It's I can't exactly remember. But
Another note here. Dave Hickey, The Invisible Dragon. Has anyone read that?
Oh yeah.
What's that about?
Beauty.
Beauty.
Great essay. One of the essays sort of has a sentence, he's talking about the 90s and kind of issues about beauty and art or whatever. And John Baldessari quotes John Baldessari saying something like, he's asked where art's going to go in the 90s, and he says, well, I think beauty's going to rear its ugly head.
That's nice. That's very nice phrase.
So the 4 essays on beauty. Or an art.
Excellent.
Beauty.
All right, I'm going to write beauty next to it. So I can possibly understand. I thought I enjoyed Tom's talk last night. It was prompting several thoughts in relation to what we're doing. I wanted to ask him, I have to say I was really very, I was very struck when he started using the word abstract. I don't know if you remember, at one point I talked about the passage from the kind of mytho-poeisis that he was evoking in one point, and I said then he moves to a very abstract thing with the pen, and the face, and said, well, that's exactly what Tom was saying. And, maybe, I don't know how there could have been such a connection. But anyway, I liked what he was saying, and then I was very taken with the drawings and the artwork. But I was thinking, I was puzzled by his gesture, not puzzled, but just thinking about it, the gesture of saying, well, I'm an artist, I'm a philosopher, I'm talking about doing these two in conjunction. What was puzzling me is why these two? And what I would have wanted to ask him is, well, I would give him an example. I had the great pleasure getting to know the Chilean and French, he became French, filmmaker, Raúl Ruiz. And Raúl did something like 127 or 28 films in his career. It's just unbelievable. Working with fantastic actors, doing a lot of extraordinary work. And I invited him to Aberdeen, and he was with us for several years as a professor in the Center for Modern Thought before he passed away last year. And I think it was last spring, and not this last spring, but the spring before. And in the interview session, it was pretty much a formality with Raúl, but when we interviewed him to make him a professor at the university, one of the members of the committee said, "Well, can you tell us what your particular interest is, or what is there an area in the university in terms of research that is of special interest to you?" And you might have expected him to say, "Well, the image or film or something." He just looked back at the person with perfect seriousness and said, "Everything. Everything is of interest to me." And if you got to know Raúl, you realized that is in fact the case. And he had a library which was just extraordinary. He anything he didn't know, he was interested in knowing about, and he would pursue it. And he had this extraordinarily arcane knowledge and interested in alchemy, and he had quite a collection of rare books. But anyway, Raúl was Raúl was an intense theorist of film. I don't know if any of you have seen his works, but he wrote several books about the image and film. He was theorizing his work. His own film work is very, very reflective. It's he's thinking about film always while he's filming. So you would expect, in some respects, you would expect Raoul to be like Tom in terms of his description of himself. Well, I theorize and I philosophize about art and I do art. But no, for Raoul, he was interested in everything. And when I listen to Tom, I get the same impression. This is a man who's interested in everything, who has a certain couple of areas in which he concentrates, but he's interested in everything. And I was just wondering about this, why this initial step of defining this opposition. Now in Heidegger there is, I mentioned this before, and I want to mention it again because it's particularly interesting in this respect. When Heidegger talks about language in particular, especially also when he talks about art, he always, in some sense, he sets up a counterplay between art and thought. And I'm using a word, this word purposefully. I'm going to try to get this distraction away from you. The preposition that I'm interested in here is gegen. When I use the word counterplay. In the essays on language, he says that we have to understand art and philosophy over against one another. Over against one another. Gegeneinander über is the actual prepositional phrase. But gegen means counter, but it's also against. Right? And the word for object in German is Gegenstand, which we could understand as literally standing over against the subject. Gegenstand. But Heidegger is trying to move this relationality implied in the relation to the object, it's the object, which also sort of says thrown out over against. He's trying to rethink that relation with this preposition, gegen, which becomes, well, I'd say it's sort of the guiding preposition for thinking all of these differential relations that we are seeing in this text, and the differential relations between the modes of saying or speaking. So the relation between thought, I hesitate to use philosophy because he tends to see that as the philosophy of the schools and the tradition, and he thinks of his own work as thought. He sets up this opposition between thought and art as a countering. And he wants us to, as I mentioned, I think, he wants us to hear in that countering the difference between these modes of employing language. So, and he stresses this, he actually wants us to hear the difference. Right? So he, in the essay called the Essence of Language, he keeps bringing poetry to the fore. And he wants us to catch the particular modality, or how, it's the sounding of poetry. And then as he's commenting on it, or weaving a text in relation to it, he tries to bring us to hear how his own language differs from that of poetry. But again, it's at the level of a sounding. He wants us to hear a difference in tonality, or a difference in modality. And so it's a Gegeneinander über. Now, thought and poetry, or thought and poetry, insofar as we're trying to think about language. Thought and poetry are, he tells us, particularly important for thinking about this, or for trying to think about language, because thought and poetry, he says, are distinctive ways in which language is engaged. And when he says distinctive, he means they stand out. The word here in German, the adjective would be ausgezeichnet. These are distinctive ways, and here you're hearing that out, gezeichnet, you hear zeichen. So again, there's this idea of a tracing out, or a standing out. There are traits that characterize these two, that bring them forth in some way, as themselves, over against one another. So the reason he foregrounds, one of the reasons he foregrounds poetry and thought as a differential relation from which we can begin to think the differential relations set up in and through language, and the relationality that opens in language. He does that because these two stand out. But the suggestion is, I think, that every mode of endeavor, every mode of doing in some way, would engage language and would have its own singular, let's just say it's singular modality or a singular way of proceeding. And so language, if language is the sort of opens a world, and if language is what in some sense gathers all human doing and acting, then we would have to think of language, as I think I've already expressed this, almost as a kind of fan. I see it as a kind of fan, where each rib of the I'm not sure what those are called, but the spokes or ribs of the fan would mark one form of endeavor, and between each form of endeavor there would be a fold or a difference. And so the space of language would be like a fan with oppositional relations between these different ways of using language. So art and thought would be ausgezeichnet. They would stand out in some sense. They would be ways in which you would think this relationality, or you'd have the most, not immediate, but the most reflective access to this differential structure. But the field of endeavor as a whole, as I said, would be something like a fan with a series of folds and a differential structure. So the question that I would ask is, why not the fan as a whole, as opposed to these two? Why set up this difference? And I mean, maybe this is just perhaps how he's working right now. So he's proceeding from that place. But that would have been my question in relation to his proposal, and I think it's very pertinent for what we're trying to do here. The other thing I point out, the other question I would have asked Tom is, you're talking about the gallery owner doesn't want you to speak to the person who might be buying something. The one thing he left out of it is that they're buying something, and that's different from the relation of the student who wanders into the gallery, without any dream of buying anything, but wants to talk with the artist, or the academic is in the same position. You're not going to be able to buy anything, so you go and you talk, right? I mean, it's a substitute relation. But
didn't you get the sense though that also what was for sale was the thought, was like the full explanation of how the image was produced, not the image itself? That it was kind of like an idea that was being sold?
Well, I think for Tom there is a very deep conceptual sense there. That is,
it's kind of art as thought.
Yeah. Which is again complicating that relation in an important way.
Or conflating, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think he's also referring to the actual structure of the art world. Artists are terrified of having their art pinned down in that way, and I think the explosion of the markets made it much worse, because that way you could be turning off the potential buyer if you are associated
that's
with
precisely what I'm
certain
talking about.
concept.
The place of the buyer, the money relation.
But if he's now has a retrospective, it's that's the art world that does that. And film, those new wave filmmakers came out of criticism, so it's always been so integrated within the medium.
So, I'm interested in what they're doing. So, because I'm just finally able to go back to the text. And there's a part there about how world and earth are related by a religious relationship and conflict. Is there any relationship to the sense of over against and conflict? Like, it seemed like quite a violent dialectic space in this moment.
Yeah, the word he's using there is, as I mentioned, struggle or conflict, streit. And he's taking that, I think, Heraclitean polemos. Polemos.
Okay,
polemics.
Yeah.
But he'd also be very influenced by Nietzsche at this point. And the word that's being used is auseinander. When he tries to talk about how in conflict two, what would you say, two essences come forth, he would say that there is an Auseinandersetzung, setting apart. Yes, an Auseinandersetzung. So he speaks of his reading of Nietzsche in this period as an Auseinandersetzung. It is the interpretive act is one of engagement, a very peculiar kind of engagement in that in coming to engage the foundations and what is in some sense unsaid in the work of the other, one is also brought before oneself to some extent, and so the act of reading the other is also a coming into one's own over against the other. So auseinandersetzung, setting apart, setting out from each other.
Over against, both over and against.
Yes,
right?
the Gegen relation would come in there as well. But the word he's using in this period is auseinandersetzung, and that's what is coming into this description of world and earth. It's the same thing with, he's using the word selbst-behauptung, self-assertion. And again, this is it's very Nietzschean, I think. He's talking about, it's his particular reading of how the will to power is a will to will. And there is a reflexive folding going on in the will to power. And I think that Heidegger is very aware of something that Deleuze picks up, which is that for Nietzsche, the affirmative act is doesn't pass by way of negation. So he's here. It's a little more, it's complicated because he's talking about a conflictual relation over against the other, but it's not a relation of negation. So that's how Nietzsche tries to think about an affirmation without resentment. And Deleuze has really some wonderful pages on this in his book Nietzsche in la Philosophie, where he describes the sentiment very, very, very nicely. Essentially, when a being is overcome by a force more powerful than it, all it can do is suffer that force and find ways to try to negate it or to avoid it or to counter it. But it can't overcome that force. And so in some, as long as the relation is one of suffering the other, there will be some form of what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. And the history of the genealogy of morals is a history of ressentiment to some extent. But the kind of affirmation that Nietzsche is seeking in the will is this will to will, which is a selbst-behauptung, or self-assertion, self-affirmation. And that is also part of what Heidegger is trying to think here. But there is as I said, there's a really troubling overdetermination in this period with the national-socialist thinking. So the self-assertion is also this triumphal assertion of a people's own nature. Okay, but and so again, I mean, I suppose this exercise is useful. There's so many dimensions to these questions, and you want to try to respect all of them because there's something I think really very important in this idea of an affirmation that doesn't pass by way of negation. And trying to think outside a dialectical structure of opposition. And Gegen is a very, it's a little bit like Gestell. Gestell is an utterly ambiguous word. It names the essence of technology and the essence of art at this moment, and he has to work through that problem. Well, Gegen is also, it's one of the master words for thinking about relation, insofar as it's a subject-object relation, the Gegenstand. And Heidegger's tried to take Gegen in another direction. I think in part because of the good again, Gegen, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I can't remember exactly what he's doing with Gegen. Etymology. Okay, now I came to a part which I said, you're going to like this, or I think I said that, or at least I enjoy this. It's where he starts talking about the structure of concealment in truth. And we went through the Heidegger's account of truth as involving a clearing, which is, in traditional philosophical terms, is transcendental in relation to what is. And in that sense, is no thing that is like, he says, like the nothing. So I'm at, let me move over to 52, thank you.
Can you give the basic?
In basic writings, it's 178. So, this relation of truth entails, he says, there is a clearing that occurs by which things stand forth or stand back or conceal themselves. Things can only conceal themselves within a space of unconcealment. So he wants us to, he's going to drive home now the point that we cannot think truth as this clearing, this opening, this spacing almost. We cannot think truth except as involving a relation of concealing and unconcealing. There must be a dimension, unconcealing and concealing. There must be a dimension of concealing. So he says in the middle of this next paragraph, I ended with the reference to the nothing that we scarcely know. Let me just pick it up. That which is can only be as a being if it stands within and stands out within what is lighted in this clearing. This is how we think the presence of the work of art as well. It is a being that stands within the clearing, that it itself opens up. So it stands within and stands out within what is lighted in this clearing. Only this clearing grants and guarantees to us humans a passage to those beings that we ourselves are not, and access to the being that we ourselves are.
Which page is it on the 51?
51 bottom. Again, this is essential. We tend to, we listen to this word about the unconcealment of a thing and the way it stands forth in the clearing, and we tend to forget that we, those in relation with that thing, must also come to ourselves in that clearing. It's not a matter of a subject standing outside and watching a spectacle, right? That this event is one that takes this, what we call the subject of the self into its movement just as much as the things of the world, right? So we come to ourselves in and through this relation of truth that he's describing. And we can only think selfhood from this relation. So, as he says, only this clearing grants and guarantees to us humans a passage to those beings that we ourselves are not, and access to the being that we ourselves are. That's both human being, but it's also other humans within this self. And it is very important with Heidegger, I'll just make a footnote here, I don't know if we'll get back to this. I did allude to the notion of mitsein at one point, a couple of days ago. Heidegger talks about the relation to other human beings at two levels in the period of the 20s, the existential analytic. There's what he calls Mitdasein, M-I-T-Dasein, which is our relation to other human beings in our activities within the world. So in everything we do in the world, we have a relation to other human beings, which he calls mitdasein. We are with others in the world. But there is another relation, which he tries to think. He calls it mitsein. And he says that for the self to come to itself, it's only in relation to other dasein. The mitsein is constitutive for the dasein. And this is a more fundamental level of a being with than mitdasein. Okay, so you have
mitsein and mitdasein.
You have to distinguish between mitsein and mitdasein.
Can you read the definition of
Mitdasein is
mitsein?
I'm sorry?
Is it mitsein?
Mitsein
Can you repeat
and mitdasein. Do I need to write that?
Yeah, please.
So is the mitsein sort of a priori to the mitdasein?
Mit with mitsein, being with mitdasein.
Being thrown with.
Yeah. So mitsein. Mitsein is what throws. Part of what throws.
mitsein constitutes mitdasein?
Mitsein and mitdasein.
What's the difference?
Mitsein is the more fundamental relation.
It's like in a certain sense the most primordial form of being there, because like mitsein is what we share.
Yes. This is a really very, it's a very This is a really crucial distinction for trying to think about community. And most frequently, when people are talking about our relations with other human beings and community, they're talking about mitsein. But if you're trying to think about the foundations of community along the way, along the lines of Heidegger, you need to think what he calls mitsein, which is this primordial being with, by which what Heidegger is suggesting is we come to ourselves as Dasein only in relation with others. And in coming to ourselves, in a world then, we can have mit-Dasein. But the relation of mitsein is the more primordial one. And he uses, in Being in Time, this is really very complicated. You have to really draw it out of the text. But the suggestion is that the Dasein is exposed to the other Dasein, the other human being, in such a way as to, in some sense, bring it before itself. And that's part of what sets this disclosure of the self underway, by which the self becomes the self. So there is this kind of almost like before the self is a self, there is an exposure to the other being.
So it's the context and basis upon which that becomes possible.
It's not context,
well,
because context is the world. It's prior to the context. It's it's like a primordial exposure. It's almost like a primal scene, this exposure. But it is.
But it's what allows that Dasein to become possible.
Yes, it allows the self to become possible, and the self then in relation to other selves in this relation of Dasein.
How might that relate to Levinas?
I think that Levinas is very influenced by this idea of Mitsein. He never says it really, but I just can't help but think that's the case, because Levinas and Blanchot were together reading Heidegger very carefully in the 20s, and they were reading Being in Time, and two readers like this, together have got to be picking up some, the most fundamental things. So I'm inclined to think that he was very marked by that thinking. But what's crucial here is that Heidegger's own relation to this question is extremely problematic. Because if you follow through, at least in my reading, if you follow through what he says about mitsein, you cannot move forward then to constitute the mitsein as a national subject. And that's what he does. He moves from this relational structure of mitsein, as he describes it in Being in Time, to to posit that the folk is the Dasein. Right? So the mitsein is this common. It's not a Gemeinschaft, but it's almost that. And so what he does is he turns this very complex differential relation of mitsein into a kind of foundation in the form of the folk. I'm oversimplifying a little bit in relation to the notion of folk, but there's a very problematic move here. But it's actually a key move for the politics. Once he nationalizes the Dasein, the national socialism is possible. But if you really explore this mitsein relation, then it seems to me that step becomes impossible, or has to be thought differently, and everything's at stake there in a certain sense. So it's a very and as I say, in Being in Time, you really have to work to figure out what he means by mitsein. It sort of surfaces at certain points, but then it retreats, and you have to thread it together. At least that's what I tried to do. Okay, with that. But it's really very important here to remember that there is, this movement that he's calling truth involves, what we would usually call the self or the subject. We mustn't forget that the artist, the one who receives the art, and all of those who will live within the space that that this event is opening and defining, they are all being carried in this process. So it's not happening in front of us, or over against this Gegen. Rather, we are in this process. We are coming to ourselves in this process. Okay, that's absolutely essential. Yes, who was that had a question? Oh, you have it.
Is there a way that you could maybe, and I'm not advocating this, but is there a way that you could
it proposed that mitsein could be adopting a national form if the idea of the nation was totally and radically changed to suit what Heidegger is putting forward. So is it kind of like a revolution that he's like putting forward where, like, granted, like, you can't have mitsein in the context of a nation as we know it, but we can sort of radically alter what we think of as the nation, and this leads into the national-socialist idea.
Well, yes, but then, yes, possibly, very possibly. But then we would have to ask what the hell he was doing with the Nazis, who were, you know, employing some very crude ideas in this respect, and you know, that he felt able to make this compromise suggests that, you know, there's something unthought here. You know, something has not been carried through, and at this point, you know, I just have to submit that, you know, he couldn't possibly, you know, have collaborated with the Nazis as he did had he not been a little bit fuzzy in his thinking.
I think I read somewhere that at the beginning he felt that he could influence it himself and take it in the direction.
Well, that's the position you were trying to suggest there.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean that's the way he said it, and but we need to understand what that means. He wanted to lead this movement. We're not talking about I'm going to you know, like the Lib Dems trying to soften the Tory program in England. We're talking about him. He wanted to be the spiritual Führer of Germany. You know, this is a well, we can know it through everything he said and everything he was doing.
Yeah.
He's trying to lead the revolution as a thinking act, and he's trying to prepare this kind of creation that he's talking about. So it is really, I mean, I'm using that word. I'm not using that word lightly. I'm not joking. He's trying he's trying to shape the revolution.
He's just unsuccessful. He wasn't able to.
He wasn't able to do it. Yeah. I mean, he wasn't able to do it. But had he been able to do it, he would have gone a lot farther. So it's not a matter of just inflecting what's going on. No. He wants to say this is it. Yes, there are problems with these thugs who are, you know, doing the work, but you know, if we can bring this together in a thoughtful and serious manner, then this can become the salvation of the West. And I was trying to say that he's very serious about this. He's talking about, he thinks the West is in radical decline, and that the humanist is in danger, and that this is the chance to turn it around. And for a brief moment, he makes the assumption that it's possible to bridge the relation between this form of thinking and the kind of acting that the Hitler and his people are undertaking. So there's he conflates at a certain moment the thought and the historical moment and the concrete actions. And you know, in a certain sense, that's again there. The whole problem is right there. He's compromised his thinking in relation to these actions. But there's not. It's not a matter of, you know, just trying to soften something. No, it's trying to harden something. You know, it's not inflecting it. It's making it stronger. And so it's in this sense, he's a revolutionary thinker. He's not collaborating. He is. He's trying to effect the revolution. That's why I would always make
it in a different direction, slightly.
Just slightly. I mean, he's trying to guide it.
Yeah, but without the racial components, as you were saying earlier, and so some key ways it would have been
also,
different.
you know, for him, he sees the violence of the fascistic violence, as I mentioned this, I think, on Monday, as preparatory. So that it's like clearing the ground or preparing the ground, and then you can really start to bring about this. But you know, he thinks it's necessary to do some raising of the ground. And if we're going to lose people along the way, well, that's unfortunate. But
necessary.
Yeah, collateral damage. It's called. We like to say today.
We don't see any of that in connection with his ambition to be rector of the university because he joined the Nazi Party.
That's the whole point of being rector of the university.
Oh, all right. Well, okay. That's why I want to do it.
But about this question on Heidegger and mitsein, I find like Lacou-Labarthe's reading of Heidegger, it's like Heidegger opens up in like sections 25 through 27 like a very radical potential of thinking about mitsein that could never be associated with a fascist politics, only through like an extreme violence. And I think that Heidegger never goes forward with how radical of a way he opens to think mitsein.
Yeah. So what were you trying to say about Lacou-Labarthe?
Oh, just that I don't think that I don't think that Heidegger's mitsein can, like, as he develops in Binghamton, can be attached to any type of traditional notion of community.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was my point.
Yeah.
Also, yeah. There is I'm really sorry I didn't bring Lacou-Labarthe's thesis. It's called The Fiction of the Political. Thank you. Lacou-Labarthe says that Heidegger is working in this text toward what he calls a national aestheticism. And I really disagree fundamentally. I don't think this text can lend itself to national aestheticism in that way. I think Lacou-Labarthe is missing some really key dimensions in this text as well. So it's not just being in time and mitsein, it's here in the way he's thinking about the structure of the work of art. And part of that is what we're going to look at in the next paragraph.
Can you spell that name?
Lacou-Labarthe.
He made this comment about the origin of the work of art, Lacoue-Labarthe.
Yes.
Yeah. One quick response is that, would it be possible to think, like Levinas thought, that like there is a radical project involved here? Sure, it can't be thought of in the context of community as we think of it now, or in the context of the nation as we think of it. But the two could like kind of forge together this sort of ideal future of the nation coming together, and almost in like this sort of utopian way, reach a kind of
I think you're fudging massively by saying that. I mean, well, we won't have a nation or community, but in some future sense we'll have an ideal nation or community. I think you have to be a little more attentive to what you're trying to say. If this is radically calling into question the notion of community and nation, then maybe we shouldn't be talking about community and nation at all for this movement. In fact, that seems more likely than this ideal structure. And certainly in Levinas, there is no ideal project for community and nation. I mean, it's just, I've got to say no in relation to that. But I think certainly we can rethink the political relation. We can rethink the state structure, or maybe not the state structure, but we can rethink these structures in such a way as to accommodate some of this thinking, but it means a really quite radical rethinking. And to my knowledge, really only Blanchot, Deleuze and Blanchot and Foucault, they were working in their ways toward this, but it's, we have a long way to go before we can envision anything there. All right, let me. What I wanted to do was to suggest let's not forget ourselves in this process of this truth of it he's describing, that the self comes to itself in this movement as well. So, third sentence, thanks to this community. Beings are unconcealed in certain changing degrees, and yet a being can be concealed too only within the sphere of what is lighted. Each being we encounter and which encounters us keeps to this curious opposition of presence, in that it always withholds itself at the same time in concealedness. He's been saying this about things, so we're certainly prepared to understand that he's going to introduce Earth with this. The clearing in which beings stand is in itself at the same time concealment. So not only are beings concealed within this clearing, but the clearing itself conceals itself. Concealment, however, prevails in the midst of beings in a twofold way. And here's what I wanted to come to yesterday, and I hesitated because it's going to take a little bit of commentary. Beings refuse themselves to us, down to that one and seemingly least feature which we touch upon most readily when we can say no more of beings than that they are. Okay? This takes us all the way back to Plato, in fact, and the astonishment of mitsein before the fact of being, that something is rather than nothing. That's where philosophy begins, in a sense, the question that starts from that astonished recognition that there should be something rather than nothing. But Heidegger's telling us that occurs in and with a kind of refusal of beings. They only strike us with the fact of their being when they withhold themselves in some way. It's only when this distance opens that we can be astonished that there should be something like being rather than nothing. If it were a matter of pure immanence, the question wouldn't open. Right? We wouldn't be thinking about it. Concealment as refusal is not simply and only the limit of knowledge in any given circumstance. The limit of knowledge in any given circumstance. But the beginning of the clearing of what is lighted. So, here is the limit in truth. But this limit is also the open, the beginning. And concealment is that from which the opening comes. Okay? The beginning of the clearing of what is lighted. But concealment, though of another sort, to be sure, at the same time also occurs within what is lighted. One being places itself in front of another being. The one helps to hide the other. The former obscures the latter. Few obstruct many. One denies all. Here, concealment is not simply refusal. Rather, a being appears, but it presents itself as other than it is. This concealment is dissembling. If one being did not simulate another, we could not make mistakes or act mistakenly in regard to beings. We could not go astray and transgress, and especially could not overreach ourselves. That a being should be able to deceive as semblance is the condition for our being able to be deceived, not conversely. Concealment can be a refusal or merely a dissembling. You see the hierarchy. Can be a refusal or merely a dissembling. We can never fully be, we are never fully certain whether it is the one or the other. So there's a hierarchy, but you can't tell the difference. Concealment conceals and dissembles itself. This means the open place in the midst of beings, the clearing, is never a rigid stage with a permanently raised curtain on which the play of beings runs its course. If you listen to that sentence, you have to then ask, okay, so what kind of stage is it? It's a mobile stage. Right? Rather, the clearing happens only as this double concealment. The unconcealedness of beings, this is never a merely existent state, but a happening. Unconcealedness, truth, is neither an attribute of factual things in the sense of beings, nor one of proposition.
Just an aside, of course this essay itself is its own work of concealing and unconcealing, right? It's its own work of thought. Like it's enacting what it's talking about to a certain extent, I guess. But, sorry, what keeps coming to mind when I read it, is the and yet. This rhetorical gesture of and yet, which was just a few seconds ago. It's happened before, and so I guess it's on talk, how we say it. I'm wondering, is this a standard, because I'm not well read in this sort of vein, is this a standard rhetorical gesture and yet? Because I just keep thinking of the Talmudic and yet, not yet.
No, this isn't very standard. I mean, most philosophical writing, certainly in the German tradition, of course we have some great exceptions, but most philosophical writing in the academy anyway, is not as written as this, not as performative.
Yeah.
Certainly Nietzsche is. Certainly Nietzsche is. No, I think it's more Nietzsche and Hölderlin, these figures. I don't think he was reading much of the Talmud at this point.
So that and yet is in Nietzsche.
Yeah, I mean it's German locution. Hölderlin always used aber, but, and no, I think I wouldn't link it immediately to the Talmud. I would see this.
It's a powerful figure of like never arriving, right? And yet, not yet, right? If you just hermeneutic. Curious.
Yes.
What is the difference in German between concealment and dissembling?
I can give you the German. Let's.
Because it seems almost the same.
It's almost the same. One is verstellen, and one is Verborgenheit, Unverborgenheit, and Verborgenheit. In this passage, let me just find it here. Yes, it's Verborgenheit. Yes, in the first phrase in which he started, dieses Verbergen, this, this concealment in that paragraph I read? This concealment is dissembling. In German, that's dieses Verbergen ist das Verstellen. Okay. So, as I was pointing out as we're starting to proceed, there are two forms of concealment, and there's a hierarchy implicitly set up. The first form of concealment is refusal. The German there is Versagen. You hear sagen, saying, the fair, noting a privative or a kind of so there's an initial opening in withdrawal, Versagen. Then within and as part of that withdrawing, there is this other thing that he calls dissemblance, Verstellung. Again, if you remember the importance of placing, thesis, setting, right, and stellen. So this is an unsetting, an unsettling really of any setting or placing or any thesis. Verstellung. So it is what obscures Darstellung or unsettles any Vorstellung. All these series of words: Vorstellung, understanding; Darstellung, presentation. This is Verstellung, dissemblance. Now he says it's not of the same order as Versagung, but Versagung as concealment, the first form of concealment, is sometimes mistaken for Verstellung and vice versa. You can't quite tell the difference, what you're dealing with. Okay. I suggested to you yesterday that this may well be where Heidegger is talking about Plato. Because Verstellung as dissemblance or as simulation would be mimesis. And it is, of course, to be expected that a text about art in this tradition would take up the question of mimesis. And this is where Lacoue-Labarthe reading is so bizarre. He doesn't attend to this. I mean, Lacoue-Labarthe is the thinker of mimesis in the last few decades in France. He didn't attend to this paragraph, and I have absolutely no idea why. But Lacoue-Labarthe's own work on Plato is very helpful in this respect, because he did a wonderful reading of the Republic, and he showed how in the Republic Plato gives us a judgment about poetry that is somewhat, how could I say, it's somewhat ambiguous. In the third and fourth books of the Republic, and you really must go look at the Republic, it's an absolutely crucial thing. In the third and fourth books of the Republic, Plato is discussing, or Socrates is discussing with Lacan why poetry is such a problem in the Republic. Why poetry and the appeal to myth on the part of the poets is such a problem. And part of the difficulty is that what we're trying to do is educate our populace and particularly the guardians, right? And those guardians need a certain kind of upright education, and we can't be feeding them a lot of questionable myths about the gods, because that will mislead them in terms of proper values and proper order of society. So initially, there's a suggestion: we can't have false myths being fed to our kids, and you might add, all those tales that the mothers are telling the kids, in the early years. We've got to sanitize the whole business and get a clear and upright representation of our political order and the gods. We can't have gods behaving the way these gods are behaving. Mars and Venus carrying on and something. You just can't have this. So, or Kronos eating his son. I mean, it's just it's a big problem for a well-ordered state. And initially, he's evoking a notion of truth and falsity. But as he goes on in that discussion, he starts to talk about what happens in staging, and the very troublesome fact that when in a theatrical production, we don't know who really is speaking. And in the Republic, as Plato envisions it, there's always each person has a role assigned to them. Identity should be clear, and it should be occupied properly by an individual. And the actor, above all, is, the actor is the most uncanny of creatures, because this being simulates other beings, right? And when they simulate other beings, they never speak for themselves. And in fact, the author of any given poetic work, as it's acted out on stage in theater, is never speaking in their own voice. So you have this, this mimetic structure whereby there is, an imitation. One voice is imitating another voice or playing out another voice. Imitation and mimesis have to be distinguished, and I'll emphasize that as we go forward. But there is this problem that you can't tell who is saying what. So no one is quite responsible for the discourse that's being played out by these actors. They are slipping in terms of their being. They're going from one position to another in some troublingly malleable way. They slip. I wish Guy were here to talk about some of this, because he's very aware of this this dimension of identity. And even worse, when we watch somebody on stage doing this, it starts to spread. We start acting like they act. And Plato, actually, Socrates gets quite carried away in this, and I think he's sort of performing this for us. He says, my God, we have people imitating, pregnant women or storms or animals, or, it's just, and he goes on and on about this, the way in which this mimetic play has a communicative character, like a disease, right? When we are around someone acting, really, or engaging this movement of mimesis, we get taken into it and we lose ourselves. So it's not simply a matter of looking at the myth and getting some wrong ideas about the gods. The problem is the way the myth is being staged and enacted and played out, so that what is really at risk in the city, if you have in its most founding events, or its most, in those events where the city is reflecting upon its own structure and its own history and so forth. In other words, in those festivals where theatrical presentations are being done, where the tragedies are being played out, if in those moments where the city is coming together to reflect itself, you have this mimetic dissolution, then that would be fundamentally threatening for the order of the city. Now, that's books 3 and 4. We then get to the allegory of the cave, and that in itself is worth a long reading, talking about how people are looking at shadows and looking at a theater of sorts, and never realizing what the true source of all of this is, and so forth. Living in the dark and the relation to the light. Okay, all of that's very important. We come then to book 10, and we're approaching the conclusion. And interestingly enough, in the conclusion, Socrates says, it's really quite an amazing statement. Well, of everything we've said, thinking about our ideal republic, surely eliminating the poets is the most important thing. It's really quite extraordinary. He says, let's perform a ritual. Let's put garlands on them and perfume them, and then gently chase them out of the city. And what he's doing at that point is he's evoking a sacrificial ritual. He's turning the poets into scapegoats, which is the origin of tragedy. So it's really very, very ambiguous and playful at this point. But he says very explicitly, what we have to do is settle this different and get poetry out of the picture. And so then he starts book 10. And in most of the accounts of art, the Platonic relation to art, you have the account which is coming from book 10, which is essentially that the problem with art is that it is it's a partial version or rendition of the thing in its truthful being. In other words, it's a partial copy, it's a partial presentation of the idea. So there is such a thing as the eidos for the bed. There's an idea of the bed, and the craftsman who makes a good bed will, on the basis of the knowledge of his craft, They will make a bed which is to some degree in conformity with the eidos, or the ideal bed. Now this, this can only be in some conformity because there are different ways of making beds. Odysseus' bed is an especially beautiful one using a tree, but not every bed is going to be set up that way. So there are different ways of rendering the idea of the bed, but basically we know a good bed versus a bad bed. The poet comes along and starts representing beds, and they don't know a damn thing about making a bed, but they think they can present you a good bed, and they convince everybody that they know about beds, but in fact there's no knowledge there at all. It's simply a perspective on beds, from a very partial sort of position, or using language in a certain way. So the poet's representation of the true bed is at a couple removes from the idea, and this copying, this imitation of the idea is at some distance from the truth, and induces a forgetting of the truth. We start to believe these poets who think they know what they're talking about, but in fact they're just imitating. Right? It is at this point we have the artistic act defined as an act of imitation, right? Imitating, giving a presentation of the thing, which looks like the thing, or seems adequate or correct. Some form of some representation of the thing. And I went very quickly over this in the first part of this essay, but Heidegger is very insistent. The artwork does not represent. It's not an imitation. When we look at the shoes in Van Gogh's paintings, it's not about getting a good image of shoes. What it is an image in which truth is occurring, in which the truth of the shoe is being given in Heidegger's sense of that notion of truth, which we've seen. It's not imitation.
But could you say maybe it's the what's the word? Whatever the product of a subtraction is, I can't think of it right now. But it is the element that you get from subtracting the two elements of the mimetic process, from the real thing and the copy. Subtract them, and what you're left with is the truth of the thing.
I'm not sure I understand.
The being of the shoes, let's say, is gotten through the truth of the shoes as shoes, is arrived at from a subtraction of the representation of the shoe from the shoe itself. It's whatever the leftover bit is.
The residue of shoeness from representation.
I mean, it seems like there's something more in the representation than in the thing itself, right? But the truth is not in the representation, nor in the thing itself.
Or something less than the
thing
itself in the representation.
But in any case, there's something that is in between both of them.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I'm following you. I'm going back to the beginning of his argument here, where he says that in Van Gogh's painting with the shoes, what is represented is the truth of this piece of equipment, which means reliability, Verlässlichkeit. It's the shoes in their Verlässlichkeit, which is the way in which these shoes, as equipment, articulate the relational world and earth for this woman. Right? So that's something more than just shoes, so to speak. It's the shoe in its being, or the shoe
in its relation,
in its truth, right? As a shoe, within the world and earth. This person. So that's what's being represented represented to the extent of my representation in the artwork. It's not a picture of shoes. It's not more or less correct, and hence the argument about whether it's left shoes or right shoes, women's shoes or men's shoes is beside the point. That's not what this picture is about, according to Heidegger. So it's not about the rectitude of the representation, the accuracy in terms of a pair of shoes. This is not even a homoiosis in terms of a conformity to shoes. It's rather this unconcealing of shoes in their being as reliability. So it's not imitation. It's not a good picture of shoes. You
But
know.
but the unconcealment comes from a reflection of the representation in relation to the thing that it represents.
No.
No?
No.
Well, isn't
There need not be any real shoes there at all.
Ever.
Well, at some point there have to have been something like shoes, but
That seems significant, though, that there is, yeah.
well, surely,
we know
I mean,
it's
you know, if you want to
something.
talk about, there has to be some sort of schema of shoe at work here. Yes, but the artwork is not simply about, you know, affecting a good schematism in terms of offering what the idea of the shoe is. There is representation. We have to be able to recognize it as shoes. But the point is that, you know, one could recognize perfectly well with a technical drawing, or even better, a photograph. I mean, if you want to sell your shoes, you don't want to use a picture of Van Gogh's shoes.
Of course.
So there has to be some kind of a schematism, some sort of general idea of shoeness there, which we recognize. But that recognition is taken into a movement, which is, for Heidegger, takes us quite outside, you know, the expertise involved in rendering a shoe. Right? So this is what he says about craftsmanship later on. You have to be damn good as an artist, you know, in rendering, in order to bring about truth. But this rendering is not the point. That in the rendering, something else has to be going on.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of like connection here maybe to be made between the ideas of nihilism that he puts forth in his books about Nietzsche and this rendering of the shoe in terms of kind of like reduction from the formal, sort of an obliteration of the world in order to kind of bring about a new one. You know what I mean? So to destroy like a precise exact rendering, which wouldn't necessarily be articulating the truth of the world that he, or Earth rather, which is kind of placing into the open, or opening, you know, a space for potential, or you know, the potential for language, the potential for new meanings and things like that. So, in a way, is this almost an act of nihilism?
No.
Just.
You really should read Heidegger and nihilism, because he has given some pretty serious consideration to this. And what he's talking about in nihilism is a forgetting of being, and this is about remembering being. So this is about, in some sense, recovering experience, not destroying experience, which is what he thinks nihilism entails. And the question of nihilism is really a very complex one. It has to do with, you know, thinking about the nothing and so on and so forth. But here, I mean, I think it's there is almost a kind of restorative process going on, in the sense that he wants us to bring us back to the question of being. It's about trying to bring us back to shoes, if you will, you know, in a way that renders them. How can I say, their place in a world of experience that entails all these existentials, the relation to death, you know, the relation to birth, and so on and so forth. Now, I think that this is not a. I don't see this as terribly. I don't see the destructive thing that we're talking about here very much. I'm a little frustrated because it gets very hard to advance if we have to stop and rehearse these points over and over again. I tried to establish in the first couple meetings that this was all about a deconstruction of aesthetics, right? And an undoing of the traditional terms for thinking about art. And I was worrying about, is this about experience, is it about Erlebnis, you know, is it about matter and form, you know, what exactly are we worried about in aesthetics here? So, you know, and now we're talking about representation, truth, you know, truth as adequatio in the modern period versus truth as concealment and unconcealment. I mean, the whole point has been to talk about this undoing of the aesthetic tradition and the presuppositions of the aesthetic tradition in order to allow for this relationality which he's trying to introduce in art and to think through its dimensions. So what you're saying is, yes, of course, and we've been talking about this for days, but if we continue to rehearse this in this kind of loose language, we're not going to get ahead in terms of thinking about what he's trying to offer. So I have to be a little bit severe at this point. I mean, if we continue fluffing about this way, we're never going to get anywhere in thinking about the text. So, yes, there is a certain amount of, undoing going on and a redoing. Yes, absolutely. But I don't see the pertinence of the question of nihilism. I just don't see it.
Okay, I apologize for holding up the...
No, I just have to answer you at a certain point because, it is, we're losing our track by going through this. And, I have to try to pull it into...
So this double movement is like, before we talk like, Earth is limiting itself, but then the artist delimits it. So there's a double movement here too. But it's a maybe naive question, but why do we need the second movement? I mean, Earth is limiting itself. Why should artists come and delimit again to us that like what?
Well, in part because of the reason, the way at least what he suggested here, that Earth has this way of retreating, right? Withholding itself. And that's what makes it so easy for us to forget the earthly component in truth. And that makes us, as I was saying a moment ago, the problem with nihilism is that we forget being. And in a similar way, because there is this withdrawal or this retreat, there can be, this assumption that, well, maybe if we can really understand the stone if we analyze the hell out of it rather than break it down and so forth. But we've lost this dimension of the.
This is refusal. This is this first element of confusion.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we can't analyze it because it's limiting itself. I mean, there's this like ontologization of
or we simply come to the conclusion that, look, well, it's all broken up, but that's refuse, it's not a rock anymore, let's continue our experiments. We don't need to worry about that, right? And it becomes literally refuse. It becomes, what is shunted aside in order to get to the essential. No, I think that, by trying to get to this dimension of the earthly, he's trying to recover again. This is technique in a sense. The technological order unfolding. From the Industrial Revolution through its more advanced and its ever more accelerated character under the drive of capitalism and all the social forces of media and so forth. All the social forces which are setting this Gestell into place, and it's accelerated. And as it accelerates, these dimensions of experience are lost to view. And human beings, they enjoy a certain sense of mastery and power and authority, and it's actually an assertion of the will to power itself. But there is in this, a massive forgetting of what it is to be human. So what is the earthly component is always there, but the problem is finding a way to attend to it and to honor it, if you will, and to draw it out. And that's where the artist's drawing becomes so important. So it's like what we were saying about the difference between measure and boundary yesterday. Boundary is proper to the earth. The earth refuses itself; it sets bounds, and things are delimited from one another. They don't go into a kind of a chaos. I'm very interested in the way you talk in complexity theory about what the state is before an event, before things take the order. But for Heidegger, saying it's not an undifferentiation. There is a differentiation at work, which he calls this setting of bounds. But it has to be remarked by the artist, or it has to be remarked by the thinker in such a way to emerge as this bounding movement. Right? And so there has to be a double play for precisely that reason. It has to be drawn.
So
its first is a sort of like an opening of difference, but this has to be drawn out as a relation if it's to become part of our lives. Okay.
So second concept.
But now things are starting to get a little more complicated because the first form of refusal, the way in which the earth withholds itself, this denial, Versagen is denial. This denial is unfortunately easily confused with something else, which is dissemblance or simulation. And this is where I'm trying to bring in the notion of mimesis. So, and I want to distinguish between imitation and mimesis, because imitation is a matter of this reproduction of the form or the image. Right? Whereas, and it can be more or less accurate, more or less precise, more or less a good representation. Mimesis is about this strange kind of repetition and simulation, whereby, as he says, one thing looks like another. When he says in this paragraph, the second form of concealment, when he first starts talking about it, he's speaking really very much in the Platonic sense. One being places itself in front of another, one being obscures another. This is a matter of perspective. Right? And the artist just takes a certain perspective and offers it then as a general representation. But as he moves from one paragraph to another paragraph, it goes from being a question of perspective and occlusion or, blocking of view and so forth. It goes from that into dissemblance. So one thing starts to look like another thing. And honestly, I can't read this paragraph without thinking about his own identification with Hitler in this period.
Yeah.
He looked at Hitler's hands and said, "Oh my God, what beautiful hands!" And so,
Wow.
truly,
You see his art?
something weird is going on, right? And that's identification, and that's mimesis in the sense that Plato was so worried about. Right? He's losing his sense of self, overreaching himself, and we see that throughout those periods. He's overreaching himself in this identification with this cult figure, right? It's the cult of the person playing itself out, and there's nothing to justify this reading at this point, but it's strange. We would not go astray. I mean, he's describing it already in this period. It's one of my biggest mistakes, that getting involved with these people. He sees it as a mistake, as an error. And throughout these pages, he's going to say this is the basis of error. This is how we get taken outside of ourselves and go astray. So what Plato is worrying about in the name of mimesis seems to be it's taking on a strength here that the first paragraph describing a question of perspective doesn't seem to quite allow. And so then when we get to the next paragraph, it says concealment can be a refusal or merely a dissembling.
Can be both.
You have the frightening possibility that you can't tell the difference. You think you're dealing with truth. No, you're dealing with mimesis. You think you're dealing with the possibility of let's say a thinking relation to truth, and everything that we're looking at in relation to truth. But in fact, you're still on the stage, with these myths. So the question: where is the difference between myth or this kind of mimesis? Where's the difference between myth or poetry in the bad sense of Plato and a thinking that proceeds from truth? And on this basis, this paragraph, you can't tell the difference. Ultimately, it says you can't tell the difference, which is an astounding statement, right? I mean, it's an assertion that there is priority. I mean, we wouldn't be thinking at all were there not that refusal of Versagen. But our thinking is always, in some measure, exposed to error in the form of this dissemblance. And so that's why I read that sentence. This means the open place in the midst of beings, the clearing, is never a rigid stage with a permanently raised curtain on which the play of beings runs its course. So it must be a different kind of stage. Right?
Mobile stages?
And there we are. It's the mimesis, a generalized mimesis. Now it can't be generalized in the sense of overrunning everything, because that would be life would be a dream, as Shakespeare would say. Or that there would be almost we could go towards psychosis at a certain point. There has to be a point where it's pinned down. Excuse me, where truth is pinned down to some extent. But this passage is making it very hard to see how one would make that determination, or where the limit would lie exactly. So he goes on then to say in this next paragraph, we believe we are at home in the immediate circle of beings, That which is familiar, reliable, ordinary. Nevertheless, the clearing is pervaded by a constant concealment in the double form of refusal and dissembling. At bottom, the ordinary is not ordinary, it is extraordinary, uncanny, unheimlich. So we think of the familiar as well grounded and secure, but in fact nothing is secure, and even that which is most apparently secure is in fact unheimlich, unheimlich. The nature of truth, that is of unconcealedness, is dominated throughout by a denial. There is no concealedness without denial. Yet this denial is not a defect or a fault, as though truth were an unalloyed unconcealedness that has rid itself of everything concealed. If truth could accomplish this, it would no longer be itself. This denial, in the form of a double concealment, always the two, belongs to the nature of truth as unconcealed. Wow. Truth in its nature is untruth. What a statement. We put the matter this way in order to serve notice with a possibly surprising trenchantcy that denial in the matter of concealment belongs to unconcealedness as clearance. The proposition, the nature of truth is untruth, is not, however, intended to state that truth is at bottom falsehood, nor does it mean that truth is never itself, but, viewed dialectically, is always also its opposite. Truth occurs precisely as itself, and that the concealing denial, as refusal, provides its constant source, again, the origin, to all clearing, the indefeasible severity of error. Error is inevitable. Quite a statement.
What do you mean by error?
Going astray. Making a mistake. We're always a little bit off because the things are always presenting themselves. Possibly.
Mistake with regard to what intention?
Well,
representation or some moral program?
Well, that's a nice way. That's a nice question.
What do they mean by error?
Could you repeat that?
Well, what does he mean by error? Error in terms of representation, not being accurate, or error in terms of some moral program?
I was understanding that.
Well, error, for example, I think that, let's try to keep it. We'll take a break in a few moments, but I think this is a very important question he's just asked. Error in relation to what? If we are no longer functioning within a context of reference to some guiding rectitude, or some truth in the sense of a correct representation of things, what would error be? I suppose, if we go back to the existential analytic, it would be a difference between, it would be taking an inauthentic relation to things for an authentic one. It would be taking, it would be thinking that we are dealing with this differential play of world and earth, when in fact we have some, I suppose, some fundamental obscuring of that. I go back to authenticity and inauthenticity because, Heidegger he still holds on to an idea that we have to be constantly seeking in a sort of a resolute opening to what's happening here. And in that openness, we would be striving always for the origin, the Ursprung, right? For the cleft, the rift, the difference. Right? And I suppose in that differential relation, maybe that's where the pinning is occurring that I was looking for. There has to be some, there's always, well, let's say that the clearing, the rift, as he says, is more in being than other beings. So there's a kind of a gradation of power or possibility, and there is always a scale of some kind. There's always a measure of some kind, but one can be mistaken in thinking that one thing is of a higher order than another. I think that's a very nice question, actually. Heidegger is clearly, when he thinks that Hitler is a proper Führer for the German people, he's gone astray. Because he thinks that Hitler is embodying, in some sense, in his act, and it's so much, the identification is with the body of Hitler, but the act is the founding of the state. And he thinks that this act of founding a state, with these acts of violence, and with this kind of, this form of imposition of order, this is a true political act in the sense of founding a state. Now, he hasn't given us the terms in this text of what it means to found a state in an authentic way, so to speak. But I think he would have to be saying 1935 here, that's not it. That's not the political foundation that we're looking for. And he had been mistaken in taking that act for a different kind of act, missing in some way the truth or taking for truth an act that was in fact a thug, that of a thug. You see what I'm saying?
But he seems to be saying that error is somehow necessary for truth, yeah?
That error is always, to some degree, inescapable.
But even though you would want to be escaping it.
You would always be striving to escape it, and that's what authenticity would be also. I mean, there's no such thing as pure authenticity. There are degrees of inauthenticity.
There's a connection here between the use of the word error and the earth in this primal conflict.
Yes.
Yeah.
The opacity of earth is part of this concealment that belongs to truth.
Well, he's going astray, but it's still early in this, democratically elected regime, right? It's
36. In 35.
Was it 36 when he's writing? I think
No, he started writing this in about 31 or 32. We'd have to look back at the initial drafts and then consider these. I don't have that much of a command of it. I think this is a development in relation to the earlier. As I remember, this stuff on mimesis is not in the earliest essay. But you have to, with that question in mind, you'd have to be looking very closely. But by 1933, things are pretty clear. I mean, it's. I think people who would try to say, well, Heidegger was among those who wasn't quite aware of just how bad it was. I don't buy that. I don't buy it. Yeah. I think it's. I think things are pretty clear. And I can't remember what the Night of the Long Knives is. Isn't that 33? Is it 34?
34 is Night of the Long Knives. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. So it's around this period. I mean, it's you cannot possibly be mistaken at this point. And the way the Jews are being treated and so forth. I mean, it's pretty clear. I still wanted to look a little bit at something in this passage which is very interesting, this notion of denial. But let's take a break and then move on.